Hi friends, Molton here and welcome back to another chess video. So today we're going to be looking at the concept of counterattacking, and I'll walk you through how you should be reacting and the questions you should be asking yourself when your opponent decides to launch a full-on attack against your king. So stay until the end of the video and I'll walk you through 3 different helpful examples, and like, comment, subscribe if you learned something from the video, and do comment below if you've also experienced yourself in a situation where you had to defend against a really aggressive opponent like this. And otherwise, roll intro and I'll catch you in the video. So I'm going to jump to the first example with you shortly, but before I do that, I want to give you a few principles and questions you should be asking yourself in order to correctly react to a opponent's flank attack. So in general, what happens when your opponent flank attacks your king is that you can react in one of 3 different ways. The first one being a more passive approach to just directly defending. This one you don't really want to do unless you're up significant amount of material and you can try to hang on, but even then you want to make sure that you play actively is usually the better option. So the second option is a counterattack in the center, which is the most principled approach, and the third one is a counterattack on the opposite flank. Now, depending on different things such as pawn structure, where your kings are castled or not castled, will determine which one of these 3 will be the most appropriate one to take. Now, if we go for our first example in this particular position, our opponent played the move pawn to g4, which is a really aggressive move. Now, all of a sudden, white is going for a kingside attack with the move pawn to g5, and queen h5 is coming next move. So we have to make a decision. Now, I'm not going to go into pawn structure so much in this particular video, but if we look at this particular pawn structure, that it's most likely going to end up in some sort of hanging pawn type of position in the center, which will give you some hints later on when we talk about specific pawn structures on what to do. But I want you to pause the video here and treat this like an exercise. Try to have a think as black on how you would handle this move in a game after g4. Okay, so for those of you who had a think and came up with a solution, I'll walk you through what the best one is now. So in this position, after the move pawn to g4, we have to realize that time is of the essence. So we don't have that much time to create counterplay. So the best thing to do here when you're creating counterplay is to create squares for your pieces, create counter threats, and also create some weaknesses that we can play for. So in this position, the first thing I would do is take on c4 to open up our light squared bishop. So if you did that, that's good. So if our opponent takes with any of the pieces, then d5 immediately becomes a weak square which we can use. You can hop a knight into d5, for example. So most likely white will recapture with the pawn, giving us this hanging pawn position which I talked about before. Now, after the move pawn to c4, this is where things get a little bit tricky. So if you spotted the next move, then well done. In this particular position, black doesn't have any time to play slow moves like what happened in the game. For example, bishop to b8. This is simply too slow, allowing white a lot of time. For example, here white continued pawn to g5, and after knight to e8, queen to h5, white is putting a lot of pressure. In fact, black still has some chances here to hold the position, but after the move knight to d6, white played the move pawn to d5, hitting out in the center, and this is a really typical pawn break for white in this type of pawn structure, opening up the 2 bishops eyeing up to the king side. So after pawn takes, knight went to g4, knight takes c4, but then white played a really strong capture on g7 here, sacrificing the piece, and this is immediately just absolutely crushing for white. So instead, if we go back, instead of the move bishop to b8, the correct move here would be pawn to b5. Now at first sight it doesn't look like this pawn move does much, but in reality it creates a lot of weaknesses in the center which black can take advantage of. So for example, we're threatening to take here on c4 and generate some counterplay by putting our knight to the d5 square. Some variations might follow. For example, let's say after the move pawn to c5, black has a really strong move here. So again, pause the video if you want to try and spot the tactic. But here the move is rook takes c5, incredibly strong. After the move rook takes c5, the idea is that, let's say if white captures here on g6, we can capture back, and now white can't capture the rook because after bishop takes, he's in a lot of trouble. For example, after rook f2, which is the only move to block, queen d5, and we see white in a whole heap of trouble along this diagonal, and black has tremendous counterplay. Another variation might go pawn takes rook, and again after bishop takes, rook goes to f2, and here after knight takes f4, white's entire king side is falling apart. So instead, other moves like pawn to g5 here might look tempting, but we can play the move pawn takes on e5, and here we have a really nice variation that takes place after pawn takes e5, pawn takes c4. Now after the move bishop takes g6, it looks like white has gotten the position under control, and after we capture the bishop, white will capture our knight. But here we can throw in an intermezzo move, this move pawn to c3, which is incredibly strong, and you can have a look, but all the complications will favor black in this very complicated position. For example, pawn takes on f6, we take back, pawn takes on g7 is met by queen takes d4, queen goes to f2, queen g4 check, and here we can trade queens and play rook d8, and eventually we'll win our piece back with a big attack on the king side. So another option is pawn takes b5. After pawn takes b5, we can play the move knight to d5, and here we have counterplay already with the move knight takes e4. So we can see black is really highlighting the fact that white has just weakened his king side completely here with this g4 move. So it's very important that you don't panic in these situations, and also just think clearly and look for counterplay. If you struggle to see the actual moves in the game, that's okay. As long as you're asking yourself the questions and trying to look for them, that is the most important thing there. And the calculation is something you can improve on later on. Okay, so now we're going to move on to our second example, which comes from a Sicilian defense, a very typical middle game position in a Sicilian. Once again, pause the video if you want to try and work out some ideas here for black to generate some counterplay. Otherwise, I'll see you in a few seconds. So in this particular position, black's main ideas in this type of pawn structure is typically to be pushing for these pawn breaks in the center with either e5, d5, sometimes f5 even is a possibility, as well as this pawn b4 break. So these are the major breaks for black. So let's see exactly how black executed that in the game. First, black captured this knight. So after capturing this knight, it guarantees that the knight is never jumping into this f5 square later on when we play e5. After bishop takes, black played the move pawn to b4. This guarantees that the knight's not going to hop into d5 later on when black pushes e5. So the knight went back to e2. Now black probably traded a little bit early. So in the game, black played knight takes d3. Bishop b7 is probably a slightly better option. It also stalls f5 because pawn takes would force white to capture back with the queen, which he doesn't want, wants to take back with the pawn in order to get the f6 pawn break in. And here we're also threatening e5 and perhaps d5 as well in some positions. In the game, knight takes d3 was played, and this would have allowed queen takes d3, which would have been a stronger alternative. But instead, pawn takes was played, and after pawn takes, black gets all his pawn breaks in one at a time. So here black played the move pawn to e5 first, a very strong pawn break in the center. Now time is of the essence again in these type of positions, so we can't sort of take a break. We need to be very quick with our moves. Here black played the move pawn to b3, another strong move. The idea is to open up the queen side for our pieces to attack. The idea is that if white takes, then we have a target on b3 to attack. Now, of course, white didn't take this and played the move pawn to a3 instead. And after the move pawn to a3, black immediately plays this move pawn to d5. Now, that's the third pawn break in a row, and that also stops white from playing knight c3 and putting the knight into d5. We're also threatening to push the pawn to d4, and we're also opening up our bishop. So now black has the bishop pair and we have good counter-attacking prospects. So let's see how the game panned out. So after the move rook c1, black played the move queen a5. Now white played the move knight c3. Now if rook to d1, then again this sacrifice with bishop takes a3 is still very, very strong. In the game, after the move knight c3, black first played d4, kicking the knight to the d5 square, and then playing this sacrifice with bishop takes a3. And if you're a Sicilian player, this is something you can keep in mind when you're attacking your opponent's king on the queen side, where you sort of weaken the position with the b pawn and then set up some sacrifices on this a pawn with the bishop. Now after bishop takes, pawn takes, queen takes, rook g2 was played because the bishop is being attacked, and also queen check on a2 was a threat. Now after this we have the move pawn takes on e3, and white played the move queen to h5. Bishop to e6 was played, and in this position white tried to generate some counterplay with the move knight to f6, and here we have to capture. And it's okay as long as we're very accurate in our defense here. White played a very tricky move. So if white just captures normally, then after the move king h8, we're perfectly safe because queen h6 is met by rook g8, and also rook g7 can't be played because of queen a2 mate. So instead what happened was white threw in this very tricky queen to h6 move, threatening to take on f6 and then open up the g file and get checkmate. So the only way for black to block this threat is to play the move pawn to f5 to keep things closed. So here we want to keep the king side closed. Now white played the move pawn to g6. Now if you take the pawn, white already has an immediate draw with rook takes g6, but the worry here is not just that there's a draw, but there could be something more than the draw as well, and this is not something you really want to do. So instead black has a really good counter-attacking blow here. So pause the video and try to work out what is the best counter defense here for black. So the best move here for black is queen a2 check, and this completely deflects the rook away from the g6 square. Now if white has to capture, we capture back, we check, king goes across, and then we take the pawn on g6. And we have more than enough compensation because we have a rook and a bishop and a bunch of pawns, especially this pawn protected on a2. The game continued rook to g1, threatening the sacrifice, rook to a7, defending along the 7th rank. This is a very useful defensive idea. Now if rook takes g6, takes, rook comes across, queen takes, and king h7 is winning for black. So therefore after the move rook to a7, we have the move pawn takes f5, bishop takes f5, pawn takes e5, and then pawn to e2. Queen to d2 was played. Now black found another very accurate move to defend the pawn, played the move bishop to g4, sacrificing this pawn with check. So if we take this pawn with check, then the king goes to g7, and after the move rook to b1, we have the move rook to f1, and now after the move pawn to e6, try to find the last finishing move to the game, black to play and win. So here black played the move rook to b7, so highlighting the fact that this rook on b1 is pinned. Now there's no way to stop the threat of just exchanging rooks and promoting the pawn. So this was a very nice example, I thought, to sort of highlight all the key pawn breaks for black in the Sicilian, and it turns out that white's attack never really got through because black was very active in the way black generated counterplay. So let's jump into the third example now. So now we'll move on to our third example. So in this position, it arose from a dragon Sicilian. So if any of you played that, then you're probably familiar with some of these ideas in this particular game. So in this position, white played the move pawn to g4, again launching an attack with the move pawn to g5 next. So it's very important that you come up with the correct reaction here, otherwise you can lead yourself into a very passive position for the rest of the middle game. So in this position, white played the move knight to e5. Now the counter-attacking idea comes after the move pawn to g5, and now black has a very typical and thematic sacrifice in the Sicilian, which if you know of, you'll spot right away. That's the move rook takes c3. So in this particular position, it works tactically because it also hits the bishop on e3. So for example, if we capture this knight on f6, then we have the move rook takes e3, and after pawn takes g7, we can just capture back if we want to, and our rook is perfectly safe. Like there's nothing wrong with it. There's no way white can really use the fact that it's on e3. After pawn takes on c3, black can play this move knight takes e4, where we sacrifice the rook, we damage white's pawn structure. In this case, white has also weakened his king side tremendously by pushing these pawns up the board, and we also get at least 2 pawns for the exchange in this situation, so it's perfectly okay for black. We have plenty of compensation, and much better in fact. After knight takes e4, for example, pawn takes, let's say queen e1, well, we can just continue with a move like queen c8 here with a fantastic position. Eyeing these light squares, we could move the bishop to h3, we're attacking the pawn on c3, so on. You could even take the pawn on c3 straight away, as black did in one particular game, since white can't capture back due to knight f3 picking up the queen. So as you can see from these examples, it's quite tricky to execute a good counterattack effectively, and it requires a mixture of understanding different middle game ideas, positions, and also being able to successfully calculate the variations. But I would much rather you ask the questions and try to look for them than not ask the questions and not consider any of the moves at all. If you're having trouble with the actual calculation part of it, then that's something you definitely can work on separately, but at least we're looking for the ideas. So I hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.